Hello again, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar on SMA treatments and clinical trials. Again, my name is Megan Lenz, the Director of Marketing and Communications for Cure SMA. And also with me today are Dr. Mary Schroth, Cure SMA's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Jill Jarecki, Cure SMA's Chief Scientific Officer, and Kenneth Hobby, President of Cure SMA. Before we get started today, I just want to give a couple notes and reminders. First, we will have a question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So you should have a button or a section on your screen marked questions. If you're listening on a computer, it's most likely to the right or bottom of your screen. If you're listening on a mobile device, it's probably at the bottom of your screen. So please go ahead and use this function to submit your questions during the webinar. And then after the webinar, if you have questions, you can send those to treatments@curesma.org. Second, I do want to remind you that this webinar will only cover information on access and clinical trials in the United States. So unfortunately, in this webinar, we're not going to be able to take any questions on treatment access or trials outside of the United States. Third, I do want to let you know the recording for this webinar will be posted within the next week. Please watch our YouTube page and our other social channels for information on that recording. And then finally, at the end of this webinar, we'll be sharing some links to additional resources. And if you're not able to grab all those links during the presentation, don't worry. The slide deck is also going to be posted within the next week. And then you'll receive a follow-up email after this webinar that will include links to all of the resources. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Kenneth Hobby, the President of Cure SMA. He's going to give a couple opening remarks.
And so we just wanted to start off by looking at this overall SMA drug pipeline. And I think we wanted to use this to show how we're going to go through the particular topics that we're covering today, the order that we're going to go through, but then also a bigger picture to kind of step back and look at what's really kind of happening, changing in the SMA community and the drug landscape right now, and what we see changing over the next year or two. So I think the way that we're going to go through the topics on this call here right now is kind of going down through the pipeline. So we're going to start off and talk first, and Mary's going to do this, about Spinraza, the treatment that's approved. It's there, the top line here on the drug pipeline that's now available to patients. We're then going to go to the gene therapy program, and that's that next program on the pipeline, the one down, which is in this kind of intermediate stage. It's finished the clinical trials, but it's pending. It's with the FDA before it can get approved and be available to patients. So that's the next topic that we'll cover. And I'll be covering that topic before handing over to Jill. Jill then will take kind of the rest of the programs that are in various clinical trial stages and go over what's currently active, what's actually happening there with additional programs that are running through clinical trials that we're hoping will get approved soon as well. So I think one or two key things just to point out before we get going is we're getting ready to move into the stage that we're really very excited about, where we're going to have multiple therapies approved. And I think we're hoping for one, maybe even two, that could come through in 2019. And so that really changes what's happening in the community, where what we're going to approach is something that's very good, but also it's going to come with some complications. There's going to be a lot more information out there on multiple therapies that may be available and approved. And that's all good. Again, there's going to be a lot of information that's going to potentially make it confusing and complicated. But what it's really going to critically add is choices for people. And so that's something that we'll, I think, touch on throughout this webinar as well. One other key thing to kind of point out from this drug pipeline is when we're talking about gene therapy, I think it really is important to kind of look, when you see this drug pipeline, there's two actual programs on there from Avexis. One that we're really talking about in detail today is this IV program that's pending with the FDA. But then there's another program that's in an earlier stage towards the end of the clinical trial area. That's the IT program. And we're going to get into the differences between those two programs, why there's two, and some expectations around those two areas. So I think with that, we'll hand over to Mary, and we'll start off on that kind of that initial top line, talking about Spinraza, the approved treatment, and where things currently stand.
Thank you, Kenneth. Spinraza is the first FDA-approved treatment for SMA and has been available for 2 years this month. Happy anniversary, Spinraza. Spinraza is not a cure, and not everyone will choose to obtain Spinraza. For those who have received Spinraza, the response to treatment has ranged from slowing of disease symptom progression to improvement in motor strength. The impact of treatment depends on variables, including age and degree of weakness when therapy was begun. The best outcomes have been associated with earlier treatment after diagnosis. Next slide. As of October 2018, 2,700 patients in the US have received Spinraza and approximately 6,000 throughout the world. The number of patients has steadily climbed, as you can see in the graph. Approximately 30% of all individuals with SMA in the US have received Spinraza, with increasing number of adults having access to treatment. Cure SMA provides a website that lists US sites that provide Spinraza. We currently have 159 sites listed on the Cure SMA website that have agreed to the public listing. We anticipate that there are at least another 100 sites providing Spinraza. The number of sites providing Spinraza has grown steadily, as you can see in the graphic in the bottom left. Following approval of Zolgensma, back up please, the website will be updated with information about sites offering Zolgensma. For questions, please contact treatments@curesma.org. Next slide. The overview of this slide is that payers are consistently covering types 1, 2, and 3, as seen by the green color in the bottom summary row of the first set of columns. They are also covering 2 and 3 copies of SMN2, as seen in the second group of columns, bottom row with the green, and pediatric patients. Coverage is less consistent for 4 copies of SMN2, adults with SMA, and those on non-invasive ventilation. The most restrictive categories continue to be for type 0 and 1 copy of SMN2, SMA type 4 or the adult onset form, and having a tracheostomy or permanent ventilation. We continue to work with payers to educate them about SMA and the impact of Spinraza. In addition, providers have become very skilled at appealing denials. To optimize motor function and strength and gains from Spinraza therapy, if one is receiving therapy, we recommend continuing to work closely with your healthcare team to receive standard of care for breathing, nutrition, and physical and occupational therapy. Please see the standard of care documents published earlier this year that are available at the web link on the slide. A word of caution about internet offers to obtain Spinraza. Please be aware of possible scams regarding Spinraza therapy. Know that Spinraza will not be offered legitimately at discounted rates over the internet. Watch in particular for people you don't know or who seem suspicious on social media. And as always, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. After 2 years of Spinraza, access has improved to treatment. More adults are being treated with Spinraza. Approximately 50% of pediatric patients under the age of 18 are receiving Spinraza. The impact of Spinraza therapy has increased infant survival. Also, the care needs are changing, and there's more variability regarding needs for breathing support and nutrition support, and close monitoring by a healthcare professional are needed. We have also learned that for infants, earlier treatment gives the best outcomes regardless of therapy. I'm now turning it over to Jill Jarecki to talk about clinical trials.
Thanks, Mary. Actually, before we get to Jill's portion, I'm going to turn this back over to Kenneth, who is going to share information on the gene therapy program.
Okay. Oh.
So after Spinraza, now we're going to look at that next program. And so this is the gene therapy program. We're actually going to start using this name. You heard Mary say there, but this name, Zolgensma, it's not finally approved yet, but that's the name that we think is going to come through when the therapy gets approved, and we'll start using that the same way that we've been using Spinraza. So you'll start to hear that a little more now, Zolgensma. So what we're talking about here is the gene therapy approach, and this is the approach that is actually looking to replace that main SMN1 gene. So Spinraza, some of the other therapies are working on the backup gene, SMN2. This is the replacement of the missing or the mutated SMN1 gene. Also with this, it's kind of the one-time treatment approach as well that we've been looking at with gene therapy. One of the critical things to bear in mind and to pay attention to as we go through these slides here is, while it's kind of one particular therapy when we're talking about the virus with the gene inside it, there's 2 delivery approaches. There's 2 ways that this gets into the body, and they make this two very different programs. Even though it's the same therapy, gene therapy, these two approaches are actually looked at very differently by the FDA, and they will be by insurers as well. And so this is something we'll show here, and there's different expectations that are going to come along with them as well. What we're trying to do is make sure that we have some very clear names that we're giving to both of these. So one is the intravenous approach, which you'll see throughout with IV, so intravenous, and then the other is intrathecal, IT. The one that's actually with the FDA now, pending for approval, and it's with that step that is out there called the BLA, the Biologics License Application. That's the one that's the IV approach. The BLA is very similar to what we've seen before, and I think it's on the pipeline slide that's called NDA. That's for drugs, the small molecules and Spinraza. This is a BLA, and really it's just the naming. It's some of the very same kind of processes that have to go. You actually have to go through with the FDA to get approval. The other approach, the IT intrathecal, is a program that's in clinical trials right now. There's quite a few ongoing clinical trials, and there will be some more in the future as well. And again, that's this split between the two programs, the IV at the top and the IT towards the bottom of the clinical trial stages, and they are different programs. What we know so far is the results that we've seen from the clinical trials for the IV approach have been very good. They've been very good in the group that was in that clinical trial, and those were generally younger type 1 patients. The thing that we do say is we really don't know anything else yet in other ages, other types of SMA. There's some trials that are going on, but the results haven't come out yet. So really, we don't know, good or bad, really a lot of expectations and good hope for them. But at this point, we don't know what the results are in those other groups. But we have seen in the young type 1, the results from the clinical trials have been very good. One of the things that we'll highlight here, and we'll touch on this again, I think, is something to do with, again, choices and timing. What we would say, and we'd recommend across Cure SMA, and again, you will hear this again, is we're telling people not to wait on future options. And this is where we're saying, if you have something that's available to you now, an approved treatment, which is Spinraza right now, an opportunity to get into a clinical trial right now, that's what you should be doing. You really shouldn't be looking to wait for something that might become available in the future, whether it's 3 months, 6 months from now. The way that we look at this is the most critical thing in SMA is really timing. It's the time that's so important to try to get treatment going instead of waiting where, again, some more damage might be caused, the motor neurons might go. It's really so much more important just to get things started now. So one of the recommendations really is everybody shouldn't be waiting for approval of gene therapy. If you have things available for you now, it's best to take those. The other thing to really highlight is there's still a lot of unknowns. And if we're talking about potential approval, we are very optimistic about it, but we don't know for sure. And we really don't have any kind of guarantees of what the actual label, what the therapy will be approved for. So there's a big risk there as well in waiting for something that we just might not know actually will happen in the end. So the next slide. So touching on the IV gene therapy approach, so the intravenous one, it is with the FDA, and our expectation right now is that the FDA hopefully will come back with approval. We probably look at it as a 90-95% chance of success at this stage where an application's in with them. And we're looking at the date when that decision should come through being May of 2019. There's a chance a little bit earlier, and these can always go a little longer as well. There's nothing that's fixed in stone, but that's kind of our expectation right now to look out and look for May of next year when an approval decision could come through. What we're expecting with that approval is that the approval will come with a label that's going to be very close to the criteria that were set up for this first clinical trial. So what that is basically for type 1s, and the way that you can also look at it is with kind of a weight and an age that go along with that as well. And so when you look at the clinical trial criteria, the inclusion criteria, they were around a weight under 8.5 kilograms and also under around kind of 9 months of age as well. So that's what we're expecting right now. There's a chance, again, that the FDA could go a little broader, a little narrower. We don't know that right now. And so this is just what we're putting out as kind of the best expectation at this point. One of the other things that we've got to see, we don't know about yet, is whether the FDA would also come through and say that it's available for pre-symptomatic patients as well. When we're saying type 1, that really goes along with the definition of being symptomatic, but there's a chance the FDA might come through on the label and say that it can also be used for pre-symptomatic. One of the expectations as well that we think is going to come through with gene therapy is that once you get the FDA approval, you have the label, then obviously it's the insurance groups that kick in. And we're really expecting that they're going to very strictly follow whatever the label is. That's happening anyway with Spinraza. That's kind of the expectation that we always should have with insurance companies. They're going to look at what's approved. They're going to look at the data that's available, and that's what they're going to base their approval decisions on. So again, that's what the expectation should be here. There won't be a lot of wiggle room with the insurance companies to go beyond what the FDA says. I think another aspect when we're talking about insurance is we think it's pretty going to be quite unlikely that there's going to be a lot of opportunities to have insurance cover both Spinraza and gene therapy in terms of paying them. So the opportunities to go from being covered on insurance for Spinraza, switching over to gene therapy and then having insurance cover that, or having them kind of both be covered at the same time is unlikely. And I think there's a few reasons for that. There's definitely the high cost involved. Insurance isn't going to be wanting to pay for two high cost therapies at the same time. They're going to want to say, we're paying a high cost for one, it should be working. Another reason is that there really isn't data as well to show that it is safe or there's actually any additional benefit to taking both or switching back and forth. And again, that's where insurance will come in and say they need to see that data if they're going to be paying for those costs. So now switching to the other gene therapy program, and this is the one that we are saying is the IT approach, the intrathecal. This is the one that's the injection, the same as Spinraza, into the spinal cord. Here, this is in current clinical trials, and there's some more planned as well. With the trial that's going on, and what we see for the timing with the recruitment, we put out the expectation for when this could go to the FDA, and again, asking for approval with this particular approach, it could be out into 2020. So the IV one, May 2019 is the timeline. For this other approach, it could go out into 2020. That's what our expectation is right now. We're looking at this other approach as the approach, the gene therapy that hopefully will come with approval for older patients, older type 1s, and then also the other types of SMA, SMAs type 2, 3, and potentially 4 as well. That's what we've got to look at. The data, again, will come from the clinical trials that are going on. Right now, the main trial is being done in type 2s, and that goes up to about 5 years of age. What we, I think, would hope is when we get to this stage as well, that the FDA might be looking to go potentially broader as well. Probably broader than they will with the IV approach. With IT, we're hoping this gives us the chance to kind of go broader and go beyond. We don't know how far beyond just the criteria of the clinical trial. I think that will rely on what the data actually shows. Again, a lot of this still depends on the data that comes out from clinical trials, how powerful, how successful it is, then how much broader you might be able to go, along with other trials that are in progress, and are they giving results and data that can go to the FDA and support that argument of, you know, the therapy here, the IT therapy has the potential and it really should work for older and other types of SMA. And so that's something that we'll see come out over the next year as we start to see results coming from the IT trials. One thing we wanted to point out, and again, looking at expectations, is we do believe that in several ways this is going to be different from when we had Spinraza go into the FDA and with the approval there. I think everybody kind of knows that we got very quick approval on Spinraza, much quicker than expected with the date that was expected per kind of FDA guidelines. The FDA came in very quickly. And what they gave in the end was this very broad label, which was really saying Spinraza is approved with a label for all ages and all types of SMA, and really in some ways without any restrictions at all. That was very unusual. It's very unusual for the FDA to come back so quickly. And in a bigger kind of picture as well, it's very unusual for the FDA to come back and give you that label that goes beyond what's actually been studied in clinical trials. So this time, we think it will be different, and there's some reasons for that, which we're highlighting here. One is that we do now have a treatment approved. We have Spinraza approved. And so this does affect the FDA when they look at how quickly they're going to move, how aggressive they're going to be. If a treatment is available, it will kind of move the FDA back to kind of one of their more traditional approaches in when they're looking at a treatment and how to approve it. I think as well, it's good to bear in mind that the gene therapy technology as a whole is very new. It's a very new approach, and it's something that the FDA wants to be cautious with. They don't want to have a new area come in and move too quickly and actually have some issues that then come up and would affect the whole field in a very bad way. I think as well with gene therapy, it is this approach of a one-time treatment that you can't go back to. It's also a one-time treatment that you can't go in and take back out of the body. So you do have to be careful with it. I think as well, the other aspect here, when we're talking about the first approval for gene therapy that we're looking at with this IV approach, and we'll get to this on the next slide, the IV approach itself does have limits, which is why the IT approach is then coming in. And so this is a very practical aspect of the delivery approach. This isn't something that the FDA is just going to say, well, we want to be very cautious and limit IV because we want to take our time. There's very practical reasons about why IV is the right approach for a certain group of SMA patients, and then the IT is the right approach for another group of patients. And that's really kind of what we expect to come through over the next year or two with those two different approaches. I think the thing we'll say again is normally you really expect the FDA to give approvals, to give the label that will very closely match the clinical trial criteria, the data that they're looking at. We certainly hope for a little bit of kind of broadening potentially with the FDA on this first one. But again, it's not going to go so far. It certainly isn't going to go for what we saw with Spinraza as we come the first time through. So then the next slide. We wanted to give a little bit here on why we do have these two approaches, why it's one particular treatment. Again, the virus with the SMN1 gene inside it is the same, but why you have two different approaches and why that really kind of makes these two distinct programs. So the IV intravenous approach is the way that you get the treatment throughout the whole body. It goes everywhere in the body. The IT intrathecal is, again, very similar to Spinraza. It's the injection into the spinal cord, into the central nervous system. And so it's just delivering the therapy there rather than throughout the whole body. And so the way that we kind of really kind of simplify it down, and there's other reasons as well that can kind of factor into this, but we think this is kind of really the key reason to highlight why when you go to older and also larger, that's kind of a key thing, older and larger patients. And so you are talking older type 1s and then usually the type 2, 3, 4 and adults. As you get older and bigger, if you were using the IV approach, you constantly have to be using higher and higher doses, more and more of the virus going in, because it has to go through the whole body. As the body gets bigger, you really have to put so much more of the virus in to get into the body, but then also kind of force its way, and it's not really the right technical term, but it kind of pushes it across into the spinal cord as well once you've gone into the whole body. And there's really some limits that everybody thinks are going to be in place with that. When you're using the IV approach, when you get bigger, you eventually have to use just so much virus that it really could actually come up against some safety issues. And so that's why the IV approach has some limits in terms of age and the size of a patient. When you go into somebody with just the IT approach, just into the central nervous system, that's all that you're going into. You just need to kind of put a smaller amount of virus just into that smaller space in the body. And so that's why when patients get older and bigger, you can put less in. You can do it just into the spinal cord. And so that's why this approach kicks in as we go beyond some of the criteria that we were talking about with young type 1s, the 8.5 kilograms. One other aspect, and it's not 100% known yet, I think people are trying to work this out and it'll be coming from some of the clinical trial data, is as you get older, there's a greater chance that you've actually been exposed naturally to this virus, the AAV9 virus. And so once you've been exposed to a virus, very similar to getting vaccines, you're then going to have that immunity. You're going to have antibodies to that virus. In this case, that's not what you want. If you've got antibodies, if you've got immunity, once you then get injected with this treatment, your body's going to be screening it out, so it won't be effective. And so as you get older, there's a higher chance that you will be in that situation. And that's where there is also a hope that the IT approach will give a way to still get this treatment, as opposed to when you're going IV, if you've got that immunity, it's just going to be screened out of your body. So I think that's everything that we're going to say for now. We will come to some more questions. I think there might be some other aspects that we talk about with gene therapy towards the end. But now just handing over to Jill, and she's now going to go through that part of the other programs that we have in clinical trials right now.
Hi, everyone. So as Kenneth said, I was going to talk to you about things that are less advanced in the drug pipeline, and both programs that are recruiting for clinical trials and those that are clinical trials that are planned. if you want to find more information about any of the recruiting clinical trials, the slides show the clinicaltrial.gov identifier, and that is really the best way to find out comprehensive information about all of these trials, including contacts for specific sites where the trials are being conducted. So the first clinical trial I wanted to talk about is Risdiplam. This is the Roche Genentech drug, and they have one recruiting clinical trial called Jewelfish. This is in children, teens, and adults ages 12 to 60 who have been previously exposed to an SMN2 targeting therapy, wish to go off that and try something new. This is a phase 2 trial. It has sites in New York City and in Europe, and I also believe that a site will be opening at Stanford University. So this trial is really to look at Risdiplam in patients who have been exposed to another drug. There were 2 other clinical trials of Risdiplam. They were both phase 3 registration trials. There is Firefish in infants and Sunfish in patients aged 2 to 25. And these trials are fully enrolled. They are continuing to monitor their patients and participants and collect data. And this data will be used to file an NDA with the FDA and the EMA in Europe and in various other countries to get approval for this drug. Next slide, please. So the next recruiting clinical trial is called SPRINT. It's pre-symptomatic study of intravenous or IV, as Kenneth just discussed, of AVX-101 in patients with 2, 3, and as listed on clinicaltrials.gov, 4 copies of SMN2 under 6 weeks of age and without symptoms. This is a one-time IV infusion, and it will be able to test how pre-symptomatic treatment compares to the treatment that we saw in the STRIVE trial. Next slide. There is a new trial for Spinraza, and this trial is in adults with SMA. It will be in adults 18 to 60 years of age to look at the safety, tolerability, and effectiveness of a Spinraza. There'll be 73 participants, and there will be visits to assess function at day 15, day 30, day 60, and then at 4-month intervals up to through 30 months. It is a multi-center trial. Right now on clinicaltrials.gov, it lists University of Washington in St. Louis as the first trial to be up and running for this clinical trial. We expect that this will be a multi-center trial with at least several other sites, and we will announce those sites on our website as they become available. Next slide, please. And then next, we have another trial for AVX-101 called STRONG. This is the trial using the interthecal approach, as Kenneth described. It's for children up to 60 months of age with 3 copies of SMN2. These would be children with type 2 SMA who can sit independently but are unable to stand or walk. The original cohorts, the low and the mid-dose cohorts, are fully enrolled. However, enrollment has started for a higher dose cohort, which is to explore whether a higher dose will provide greater opportunity for additional efficacy. The entire trial will have 51 subjects at multiple sites in the U.S. Those sites can be found on clinicaltrials.gov. Next slide, please. We know of a number of other trials which are planned in the next year or so. Several of these trials are to test drugs that are non-SM enhancing drugs. This is one of our strategic goals at Cure SMA, to start to develop combination therapies for SMA that would include SM enhancing drugs plus other drug approaches. And the first, one of the first of these trials to do so, we believe, will be Scholar Rock. Their drug is SRK-015. It is a myostatin inhibitor, which allows muscle strength to be enhanced and muscle bulk to be enhanced. They have conducted a safety trial on healthy volunteers, and they are proposing to have patient trials in SMA with 2 cohorts. One cohort would be for patients who are on SMN upregulating therapies, and another cohort as a monotherapy. We don't know anything yet about enrollment criteria, although Scholar Up has said that they recently announced that this trial should begin in first quarter of 2019. So Kenneth talked about AVX 101 and testing it for intrathecal in a broader patient population with the goal, I think, of having a broader label. And the trial that we believe will collect data on a broader patient population for the one-time IT injection into the CNS is REACH. This will be a multinational trial. It was projected in the past to start in early 2019 for types 1, 2, and 3 SMA. Likely there would be about 50 patients between 6 months and 18 years of age. However, we haven't heard any updates on timeline beyond that original projection of early 2019. There's another muscle function drug from Cytokinetics called Reldesemtiv. They will hopefully be beginning a phase 3 trial in patients with SMA. They completed their phase 2 in 2018 and released data on their phase 2. However, enrollment criteria and timeline has not been released yet for this trial. And then finally, there is another trial of Risdiplam. This will be the Roche Genentech drug. This will be in pre-symptomatic infants with SMA. It will be called Rainbow Fish. We also do not know a timeline for when this trial will start. When we find out more information about each of these trials, including timeline and enrollment criteria, we will do latest news posts on our website and provide information to the SMA community about them. Next slide. So, as Kenneth touched upon, one of the things we get asked a lot is how should you decide to go into one of these clinical trials or use the approved drug? So, as Kenneth alluded to, one of the things that we advise is not to wait for future trials to open if other options are available now. And there's multiple different reasons for that. The first is that delays in opening trials are common and they can't be predicted. And often they don't mean that there's a problem with the program. It just means that there are things that need to be worked out and planned. And a 6-month delay is very common in drug development. Also, that there can be changes in inclusion and exclusion criteria until the trial is formally announced. And that may mean that you've been waiting for a year to be in a clinical trial, and then at the very end, you find out that you will not be eligible for that trial. And that's a year you could have been on the FDA-approved drug. And, the evidence in SMA, both in animal models and in human trials, suggests that the administration of SMN-enhancing drugs yield the best results when given as early as possible. And I think we believe that timing is one of the biggest factors in the degree of response to SMN upregulation. So we really recommend that you get on an SMN-enhancing therapy or someone in your family as soon as possible or as feasible, and not to wait for future trials. Next slide. So we tried to list some things that you may want to speak with your physician about when trying to decide whether to go on an approved treatment or trials. This is a very personal decision and should be made in concert with your physician. There's really no right or wrong answer, but some of the things that should be discussed with your physician is an understanding of the available safety and efficacy data. A later stage trial, like a phase 3 trial, will clearly have more safety and efficacy data than a phase 1 trial, and it's important to understand that. You need to know the possibility of there being a placebo Small molecule drugs are much more likely to have placebos than other drug modalities, say like a biologic, like a gene therapy. And type 1 SMA is much less likely to have a placebo than type 2 or 3 SMA. The FDA has been requiring that most trials in type 2 and type 3 have a placebo. So this is very important to know. You should discuss the route and timing of administration, how often the drug needs to be administered, how it needs to be administered, IT, is it an oral drug? You need to understand the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. Often the inclusion criteria will be obvious, but exclusion criteria can keep you from being eligible from being in a trial. So make sure you understand that. And then, as Kenneth talked about, previous drug exposure and whether if being on an SMN enhancing drug or having been one in the past will prohibit you from being in a clinical trial. And most trials today will prohibit co-utilization with Spinraza. This is particularly true if it's another SMN enhancer. As we just heard about the Scholar Rock drug, if it's something like a muscle enhancer, it might make sense to test it with another SMN enhancer. But the reason it's difficult to test one drug in the background of another SMN enhancer is that increased motor function, or whatever the primary outcome of the trial is, has to be statistically seen as being enhanced across the entire study population. And that can be very challenging to do if the first SMN enhancer, say the FDA-approved drug, Spinraza, is giving you 80 to 90% of your increase, and then you add the second one and it's giving you a 10 to 20% increase. It's going to be very hard to detect that signal, and you might actually throw away good drugs if you're testing these drugs together. Next slide. And so just talking a little bit more about combination therapies, Kenneth talked about whether we anticipate insurers that will pay for using 2 SMN enhancing therapies at once. And I think that in order for that to happen, if it is feasible at all to happen, we're going to have some understanding and data showing that using them together is safe and more efficacious than using one SMN enhancing therapy alone. And so I think some of the things that we are going to have to know in order to even have this be in the realm of possibility is, are they safe when used together? Is there additive clinical benefit? It makes no sense to take 2 drugs if one drug alone can do the job of what taking 2 drugs is doing. Do the benefits of taking them together outweigh the risks? Does taking one drug reduce the efficacy or availability of another? This is very common with drugs. Taking a second drug can cause the first drug to be cleared more quickly from your system. Obviously, with an ASO or a gene therapy, this is probably less of an issue than with small molecules, but this is a very common thing in the drug world. Can they easily be given together? And so for 2 SMN enhancing therapies, I think something to think about here is, do they work by 2 different biological mechanisms? If you take 2 splicing modulators, you may not expect them to have an added benefit. But if you took something that turned the gene on and then a splicing corrector, you may expect them to be having added benefit. But I think this would need to be shown in animal models and other preclinical studies. Do they increase the level of SMN more than using them one drug together, the 2 drugs together, than using either of them alone? There's no point in taking 2 SMN enhancing drugs if the overall levels don't go higher. Perhaps they could target different cell types. So if you could then cover more cells in the body, it may make sense to take 2. If you have a longer duration of SMN increase, it could make sense to take 2. But all of these things need to be investigated and thought out carefully before giving combination therapies. And as I said, readouts and trials with combinations of 2 SMN enhancing therapies are going to be quite challenging. So these are just some things that our community has to think about and start collecting data on if combination therapies are our goal for the future. Thank you.
And I'll maybe just jump in just to kind of reiterate this key point. I think Jill was saying it well there. I'll tie it back, just talking about clinical trials, I'll tie it to kind of, approved therapies in the future as well. I think the two key words to kind of focus on, we're talking about now, and then we're talking about the future. We're saying really now, you have choices of an approved treatment, having an approved treatment in one of the trials that lets you do both at the same time, or the clinical trials that are just on their own without having a Spinraza there as well. Those are all valid choices when they're available now. They're personal choices, and hopefully it's just getting all the information together and making a decision about which of those is best for you now. What we're really saying, though, is don't be waiting for something in the future. Take what's available now. It really, in our viewpoint, is not the ideal thing to do, to wait for something that might happen 6 months in the future and delay this timing of getting on one of these SMA enhancing therapies right now.
All right, thank you all. So we're going to move on to a little bit of Q&A. I do want to acknowledge that we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions during this time, but please do keep sending in your questions either to this webinar or to treatments@curesma.org after we get through this webinar. So what we'll do is we do use this information to help guide future webinars and future communications. So again, please keep sending in those questions. So our first question comes from a family whose child is close to the projected age and weight limit for IV gene therapy that Kenneth, you spoke about earlier. And so they're asking a two-part question. First, I think we already touched on this a little, but what is the expected timeline for approval? And the second question is, if the family is close to that limit and feels that they might age out before there's approval, are there any other options to get gene therapy now?
So on the timing, that is the May 2019 that we're expecting for the FDA decision to come through for the IV approach for gene therapy, so May of 2019. In terms of kind of an option for this interim kind of stage that we're at, we're in this kind of stage where the trials have finished, but we're waiting while the FDA makes the approval decision. And so one thing that happened in the past when Spinraza was going through the same stage, there was what was called an expanded access program that was available for patients to get access to the treatment while we were kind of waiting. And so there is something that's getting put in place by Avexis that's similar to that. It's going to be called a managed access program, and there should be more information coming out on that. We should be able to kind of have some links, and there's information available at Avexis as well. This is something which is, again, available in the interim, and it is this idea of there aren't opportunities right now to have the approved gene therapy or get into clinical trials for certain groups of patients. And so there's a chance for people to get access through this managed access program, much more through what's called an individual IND. And so this is much more kind of a case-by-case situation rather than what we saw with Spinraza, which was an expanded access program where it was broader and it had defined criteria for people to get into. This will be kind of case-by-case, and physicians have to submit individual requests to try to get access. That is probably the best chance to see about gene therapy in this interim period. I think we'd say the expectation there should be the access through the managed access program, that the criteria, again, are going to be close to the clinical trial criteria that have been studied. If there's other clinical trials available to get into, or if the criteria for your child is way outside what's been studied, then the program's not going to be available. So really it's it's mostly kind of younger type 1s, and it's kind of that weight area as well, around that kind of 8.5 kilograms. Maybe a kind of a little bit of leeway each side, but not too much. It's if you're in those criteria, this program might be available to you, and it's something I think to look at. Again, that was on kind of a case-by-case basis, and there's kind of individual physicians that have to submit those requests going in.
Fantastic, thank you. So For the next minute, I'm going to try to summarize a couple different questions that we're receiving. This is on another topic that was touched on during the presentation, but I want to be sure we address this in depth because this is something that's on the minds of several folks. So infants who are already taking Spinraza, will they be able to take gene therapy assuming they meet this label criteria? And I'm hearing questions about two different scenarios. So some are talking about switching from Spinraza to gene therapy, and then some are talking about taking the two together. So can you just address again, do we think either of these scenarios are going to be available again for those who meet the label criteria?
So maybe I can take that first, and then Jill and Mary might want to weigh in as well, and we'll try to answer it in the best way possible. So I think what we expect to happen is if somebody's on Spinraza and it's being paid for through insurance, the chances of being able to then have insurance pay for gene therapy in the future as well are quite low. And so either as staying on Spinraza or stopping Spinraza and then taking gene therapy, this is where really kind of the insurance is going to kick in, and they're going to be saying there isn't data available to support doing both of them, whether it's at the same time or one after another. And so that's kind of the expectation when we're talking about insurance coverage. Some of the people that have been in clinical trials for Spinraza certainly probably going to have a better chance of getting gene therapy than paid for insurance, because insurance will only really kind of see the one that they're paying for. I think we're not quite sure in this managed access program. There's some chances, it sounds like, in that somebody could be on Spinraza, have access to gene therapy through the managed access program, and potentially maybe go back on Spinraza again. It's kind of that aspect of their insurance would really just be paying for the Spinraza part. Insurance wouldn't be looking at paying for both or switching between the two of them. Jill, do you want to add anything, clarify anything there first?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you talked about data supporting the use of the two drugs together, and this just simply doesn't exist right now, really in human or in animal data for SMA.
I'll maybe say another point as well, and then to Mary, but we're talking insurance there, the practical part of getting these two therapies paid for. Separately from that, though, just as a personal decision of whether you would want to take both, the data should kind of come into play there as well, and that is an aspect that Jill's saying, there isn't data that it's safe to take both, along with there isn't data to say that if you take both, you're going to have a bigger impact as well. So it's impacting on insurance, but it also should be something that each individual would look at as well on whether it makes sense, whether you want to take that unknown risk or an unknown benefit as well of taking both at the same time, even if it was available somehow. Mary, do you want to add anything?
I think you've both laid that out very well. It will be something that will evolve over time as we gather more information. And it's going to be a very specific on a patient-by-patient basis as to what the options are and how you weigh them.
Great. Thank you all. So let's switch topics just a bit for our next question. So this question is about risdiplam. Jill, you mentioned 2 fully enrolled trials and 2 currently recruiting trials for this program. And so a member of our audience asked, kind of for the next particularly year or 2, do we have any idea about how quickly this program is progressing and what might be the next steps for that?
So right now, the 2 phase 2 trials, the trials that will be used for registration and provide the data to support a new drug application to the FDA, are fully enrolled. However, they are still ongoing. For instance, Firefish, which is the trial in infants, the original primary endpoint was at a 12-month period after drug treatment. So the babies would be enrolled, and then they would be on drug for 12 months. And so both of these trials have to reach the completion for the amount of time of the trial duration and the time that the participant needs to be on drug. Once that data is collected and submitted, once the trial ends, that trial will be collected up and put into an NDA and submitted to the FDA. Right now, we don't have a timeline for that. There hasn't been a publicly disclosed timeline, but we do know that the trials are fully enrolled and going well.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill. Let's move to a question about insurance. And so again, Mary and Kenneth, you each touched on this a little. The question is, have you seen it be challenging for families to get insurance authorization?
Mary, do you want to go first?
If we're talking about Spinraza, it can be challenging, and it's really working closely with the prescriber and their office. Most offices that provide Spinraza have a system for getting prior authorization. It can be challenging, but it also requires patience and determination by the physician. There are there are criteria that each insurance provider has, and those insurance criteria are changing as the policies get reviewed, and as we have more information about the impact of Spinraza.
And to just add a little bit, I think that's what we've seen so far with Spinraza, that we have an FDA label that says it's approved for everybody, but the insurance groups have been kind of looking at some of the extremes on kind of the spectrum that we have. And I think what they're saying is, they're questioning if there's data available. Is there support from clinical trials to say, there's the benefit there of taking this particular therapy? And that's where we see some of the pushback for adults, type zeros, or sometimes kind of older type ones. And so it's definitely something we push back on. There's a lot of rationale for the support of this therapy. Spinraza in particular is going to have benefit across all types and ages of SMA because of the way that it works on the backup gene. But I think as well, it's, the insurers are looking for that data, and I think that's one of the reasons that you even saw on the slides today. Biogen as well is collecting more data. Some of it's real-world data from patients on therapy and showing that to the insurance companies, putting it out at conferences, but also doing additional trials. So that adult trial that we're seeing there, that's being done to collect that data in a clinical trial setting, and that would help kind of give evidence, mostly, I think, to kind of, show patients as well, making decisions, but also to go to insurers and say, look, we've got data, we've got evidence that it's valuable and that they should be covering as well.
And the only thing I would add to that is that Biogen is also continuing to follow those patients who participated in the clinical trials, and they're giving us more data over time about the impact.
Great. Thank you all. So we have time for just one or maybe two more questions. So this question says, I understand that insurance is probably not going to approve for my child to go on both Spinraza and gene therapy. But my question is, will insurance companies allow me to make that choice? So I can interpret a little. I think what the question is asking is, do we expect that insurance companies will approve Spinraza, approve gene therapy, and allow families to choose which one they want to go on? Or are we thinking that perhaps insurance might try to push, type 1s toward gene therapy and types 2, 3, and 4 to Spinraza?
So the way the question is being asked there, and the way you're saying it, Megan, I think we're saying pretty strongly, and this isn't the question, that insurance isn't going to be covering both at the same time. That's our kind of expectation there, that they'll say one or the other, but not going to pay for both at the same time or switching from one to another. In terms of, will insurance push people to one or the other? Not in any general way. I think they're going to follow the labels, and if somebody's asking to go on one of the therapies that's not in the label, and that would be more for kind of the gene therapy where we're expecting this narrow label to come through. Insurance is not necessarily going to push you to the other, but they're going to say they're not going to cover the gene therapy if it's out of label. That's kind of that off-label part where insurance doesn't pay. And so they'll be kind of making those decisions to only cover when in label. Will insurance be involved in saying, okay, you're in the label for both, we prefer you to do one or the other? Maybe a little, but I think more that comes from physicians, individual physicians, patients' families for sure. Maybe some of kind of the medical agencies that'll start to weigh in on kind of the clinical trial information and data to kind of say if you've got a choice of both could be covered by insurance, which one to go for. So it won't be so much the insurance pushing that, I don't think.
All right, we have time, I think, for just one more question. So Jill, you mentioned that the REACH trial for gene therapy is likely going to enroll patients up to 18 years of age. And we have several folks asking if we've heard anything about gene therapy trials in adults and if and when those might open.
So I think the REACH is the only trial we've heard about in regard to another trial for the intrathecal delivery that would have a broader selection of patients. However, I would say that those criteria that are listed are not the final criteria. We haven't seen the enrollment criteria for the trial, and so we don't actually know what they are. We will, of course, announce those to the community as soon as we hear about a timeline and actual criteria for that. Kenneth, have you heard any additional information, or Mary, about REACH?
No, nothing in addition. I think it sounds like right now it's kind of penciled in to be that group up to 18 years of age. I think it would then be kind of questions of, does that get expanded, or are there separate trials, studies that are done in adults? I think as well, the question on this part would be, is this kind of the stage where there's enough data kind of coming together where you can go to the FDA and say, you know, we're seeing a trend here and it's working across a lot of ages and a lot of types. And so while the studies have been done kind of building up in all these younger groups and then type 2, 3s and up to 18, that's maybe the time to push, probably again only on the IT approach with the FDA, and to say, you know, again in SMA it makes sense. It's the same disease, same genetics, just because it's an 18-year cutoff doesn't make a difference, and you know we'd really kind of push for the label to be kind of expanded. It will come back though again, the same as we're seeing with Spinraza, the insurance companies will be asking for data, so we can push with the FDA, but it'll still, you know, come down to whether it's real world or other studies that can kind of pull some data together to support the insurance coverage over time.
All right. Thank you all, and thank you everyone for joining us today. On the slide here, we've listed some of the other resources that are available. So several links to our website for any for any drug program that is at a pivotal stage or is more advanced. We've set up an individual page that contains information on that program. So for Spinraza, for Zolgensma, and for Risdiplam, you are seeing those links here. Also the link to the Spinraza sitemap, which Mary mentioned in her presentation, a link to current trials. These are trials that are currently recruiting participants, and then also a link to our news section where, as Jill mentioned, we often post information about new trials that are open or about new data that has been released from those trials. So again, if you're not able to grab all these links right now, don't worry, we'll be sending those out in an email after this. I've also listed our email, treatments@curesma.org. Again, the questions that we receive, these really help us determine what kind of webinars and other communications that we need to put out there. In addition, if you've got a question that's very specific to your situation or to your child's situation, treatments@curesma.org is the best way or the best place to direct that question. And then finally, I've included links to our social media channels. So several of you have asked, yes, a recording for this webinar, as well as links to the slide deck will be available. And the best way to see those announcements is to follow us on social media. So again, thank you all. I want to wish you all happy holidays, and we will be in touch in the future.